Hi and welcome. Today I'm interviewing Barry Jones of Italian Motorcycle Engineering about the two Magni Australia prototypes you can see behind us. Now, a good place to start our story would be with the person responsible for these two prototypes, Ted Stolarski.
Good morning, Michael. Yes, Ted was a fabulous bloke. I met Ted first in 1981 when he was travelling over to Victoria. I was at Boldore at the time, Boldore Motorcycles in Richmond. And he was the most interesting character. His philosophy behind his dealership for Moto Guzzi, local people would understand he was a West Coast dealer. He carried spare parts for all the current Guzzis. He imported himself direct into WA. And his philosophy that really impressed me was he bought a spare bike of every model when he brought it in.
Really?
And he used that for spares. So he knew he had one of every part available. And Ted had the reputation for being quite expensive for parts, but on the other side he always had the part. A little bit more. You could order from Western Australia up to about 5 p.m. in the afternoon. You'd have it there on the doorstep at 8 a.m. next morning. So Ted was really well tied up with the factory because of this. I think they were selling 95 bikes a year, something like that. Guzzi distribution in Australia has never been huge, but he was selling a good, probably 30% of them.
That's probably more than they're selling today.
It could be. I don't know the current sales figures, but yeah, it'd be very good. He was always very happy. He got on very well with them. And of course, in later years, when I started Italian Motorcycle Engineering, I was buying a lot of parts off him. I was back in 1988. And when he'd come to the East Coast, he'd use my place in Upwey here as a home base. So we shared a few beers at night and talked about the stories behind it. I bought bikes for him, sold a few bikes, and that was fine. But the beauty of Ted was his ability to get to the factory, to get to know people, to network his way around. And with that in mind, when John Whitner was building the 8 valves, John Whitner was very successful through the 80s, through the middle 80s, racing his Guzzis in the USA. Of course, Dr. John wanted a faster engine, so Dr. John at the time, he decided to work at the factory for a while, and the factory took this as a great blessing. So Dr. John designed these particular top end on these engines, kept the stroke, moved the cylinder studs out further.
So the motor at the bottom end of the motor is pretty much similar to the Le Mans engine.
Pretty much Le Mans 1000 from that period.
It's just had the studs moved, hasn't it?
Studs moved out. You can see, if you look at some of the photos on the Magni website, you'll see those, it's actually been welded up. Instead of 6 bolts, there's 4 bolts, and provision for those is made by building up material on the outside of the block and welding up. And supposedly there were 4 of these engines built. I was speaking to Theo Lamus recently, and he was saying that it's quite possible there was up to 7 engines built. And Theo actually has what is possibly the 7th there, but it's only a rough casting, it's not finished. So with that in mind, Ted heard about this. He went over to the factory, and being as enthusiastic as he is, most incredibly enthusiastic man, he, do I say conned or...
Talked the factory out of?
Took the factory out of an engine and transmission and final drive. Took the engines to Arturo Magni, the engine transmission up to Arturo Magni to build a couple of bikes. That would have been in 1989. Arturo, of course, Arturo Magni was interested in building a race bike as well, A, for promotion, B, for setting up his own chassis, because the Daytonas were coming out as production engine. So he wanted a basic engine there to build his frame from. And he worked from Ted's machine. So
I gather Ted got the frame for no charge in the end.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. It was probably a gentleman's handshake and a bottle of wine, I would imagine. It is Italy after all. And Giovanni at the time was a younger man, and he was sort of all part of it, so he knows the full history of them, of course. And well, the bike came back to Australia. He had Amedeo Castellini. He had brought out from England at the time, and they took the bikes to the USA. Did rather well. They were running 7th at Daytona in the Battle of the Twins.
What year was that?
That would have been 1988 or 1989. It would have been 1989 by this stage. Because the bike only took two weeks to build. It was bang, done.
I suppose we should mention the fact that this is the first prototype, the green one, and the red one, it was the second prototype built, a year later?
A year later. This one was built 1990 and 1989. As you'll see with the two bikes, there's a fair difference between them as far as technology of the day goes. A year before, when P1, prototype 1 was built, the Facella Italia forks were the greatest around. Brembo 4 spots with the magnesium Brembo 4 spots were the best calipers around. The rotors, 280mm rotors, were pretty much de rigueur. They were the trend at the time, so that's what it had. The rear WP suspension, some of the best suspension. Originally this came with Coney's, but on his trip to the US, he managed to acquire some WP suspension from
That's right. He actually talked to White Power about doing some rear shockers for him, didn't he?
He did, yes, and they come up with the goods and much improved the rear end handling of it. So that was that basically for P1. P2, 12 months later, as you can see, White Power forks as well, 320mm rotors, so the rotors are significantly larger. And you notice it straight away. As soon as you ride the two bikes comparatively, this one stops on a dime. It's really, really impressive as far as that goes.
And there's a frame difference between the two, isn't there?
Slight
Similar
difference,
construction?
yes. Similar construction. They pulled the steering angle back a little bit. They brought it back to 26 degrees from memory, so that was much better. Bob Martin always said 26 degrees and 100mm of trail. And there you've got it, whatever bike you want, it'll handle magnificently. And Bob Martin, to those who aren't aware of who Bob Martin is, was probably Australia's premier chassis builder, to the likes of Fritz Egli and Arturo as well, Arturo Magni as well. Absolute legend. Not long after I was given the responsibility of looking after the first prototype, I stripped the bike, took it around to Bob, and Bob put it in the frame jig, tweaked it as far as he could to get the steering angle back a bit further. We reset all the geometry so it became much more nimble than it previously was.
Did you do that by offsetting the steering head bearings, did you?
No, it's basically just twisting the frame.
Oh, twisting the frame, old-fashioned.
It is old-fashioned, yeah. It's what you can get away with on many chassis. Often when a bike's crashed, any sort of motorcycle runs into something, the frame's always bent. It's guaranteed. And Bob's business was doing insurance jobs, pulling those frames back into alignment again. And generally when he finished, they were better than original. In fact, many people, when they bought a new bike, I remember a lot of the Suzukis at the time, they would bring him into Bob, and Bob would straighten the frame from ex-factory and make it handle better from the word go. Anyway, as far as other changes, the engine on this is a little bit different. This one has C-kit cams. P1 has prototype cams, which were quite mild. They're actually very mild.
Similar to the factory cams on the Daytona, were they? The first model
They're
Daytona?
probably even milder. They were very, very mild. It only had 75 horsepower when we first got it. So we did a lot of tweaking. That was the first thing to do. It didn't perform anything like this when we got it. So a lot of tweaking, a lot of time spent on the dyno. Different camshafts. I had the Craig Bondini and Clive from Wade Cams at the time. They both helped considerably. And different inlet cam to the exhaust cam. We had a big fat inlet cam eventually and a very mild exhaust cam, and that worked with the exhaust beautifully. Bigger valves, we put 4mm bigger inlet valves into it, which worked much better, kept the exhaust small. Fair bit more compression, squeezed the compression up, dialed the cams in. Originally the cams were quite retarded, so they were put back in with more advance. And that was eventually, from the original modification of 75 horsepower to just tuning it and getting it right, brought it up to 85. And then the following modifications we did brought it up to 115 horsepower at the rear wheel. So far more respectable. As far as a Bears racer goes, it wasn't too bad. As far as unless you're racing against a Briton or a factory Ducati, it's fairly insignificant. But as far as racing against local other machinery, yeah, it was quite competitive in Bears classes and that.
So what years was this actually raced, the P1 prototype?
P1 was raced over in the US, then it was brought back to Australia. It was raced through the 91, I think it was the date it was taken to New Zealand. They did some race meetings over there. In fact, they raced at a drag meeting. Simon and Ted. Simon Turner was a rider at that stage. The original rider at Daytona was Owen Coles, and he did the race across the US. When they came back to Australia, Owen was offered a commitment by Ducati in Europe, so he took that job, and Simon Turner was next in line. Simon's Keith Turner's nephew. Keith Turner was Barry Sheen's teammate with Suzuki. So Simon's a natural rider for it. And they had a bit of a laugh one night and took it to the drags, and I think they did fairly well one night in New Zealand at the drags. So acquitted themselves very well.
But the two bikes were never campaigned together, were they? Or were they maybe once or twice?
The only time I saw them race together was at Bathurst. Now, I could be wrong there, because as far as I know, from 91 onwards, the P1 was brought over to the East Coast. Moto Italiano had it at that stage, and that's when I first saw the bike in their workshop. Thought, ooh, that'd be nice to ride. From then on, this one, P1, pretty much stayed on the East Coast. It was campaigned up and down. A little bit by Moto 1, then it was given to A1 Motorcycles, and Steve Brogue rode it. Good rider, Steve, beautiful rider. Again, a bit outclassed in many of the classes by that stage. Technology had progressed. This one stayed in the West. It was taken to the US. They did have an effort at racing it in the US, but they had all sorts of problems with customs and finance, and everything went pear-shaped for them. So unfortunately it wasn't raced there. But it was brought back to the West. It was ran by Four Cycle Motorcycles. Many people remember them. In fact, they're possibly still around. I haven't looked recently. Raced by them. They did very well. Over in the West, it's a beautiful bike for riding on something like Wanneroo. It's got heaps of gobs of mid-range torque.
So you're talking about shorter circuits?
Shorter circuits, yeah. And the parallelogram, of course, suited the shorter circuits quite well. With a short wheelbase, good suspension, good grunt. There was nothing to see Simon coming out of a corner with his knee on the ground, stuck between the cylinder head and the ground. And, yeah, just letting it all loose.
Speaking of the rear end, you discovered that there were some issues with this signature Magni design of the rear end.
Yes, beautiful design. Beautiful design. However, all designs have limitations. Now, unfortunately, we found the limit of this design at Phillip Island, and the Bass Kink in particular. When you have two fairly lightweight swing arms moving simultaneously with 8 moving joints, if every moving joint has 1 thou clearance in it, by the time we compound all those components, in a high-speed circuit, cranked over for a long time, Bass Kink's a very long corner, and you're on full power all the way through it, things start to oscillate a bit, things move. And a friend of mine, Alan Curran, Crank Tech, he was following John Ryan, one of our 250 Proddy riders. Great rider, John. He rode it for a while, and Al was following him down through Bass Kink one day. And he said, Alan said, the back wheel is moving sideways about 30 millimetres. Just rocking sideways about 30 millimetres. He got off and screamed at Johnny to just have a look at the back end. He thinks something's broken. Well, there was nothing broken. Unfortunately, we found the limit of that multi-component suspension.
Which probably became more apparent as the horsepower went up on the bike, I guess.
It certainly did. This one probably stayed at the same horsepower. There's never a problem. No real reinforcing on this one. The one on the swing arm on that one has been reinforced to try and get the best out of it. And I think we got the best out of it. But in the end, circuits like Phillip Island, we had to go to a monocoque swing arm, aluminium box section, sorry, I should say. And that was good. That worked well. It didn't give the subtlety of suspension that the parallelogram gives, but it certainly kept the wheel in line down through Bass Kink and made you a lot more confident turning into Honda.
Yeah.
When you're coming into there at high speed.
I suppose next we should really cover the passing of Ted and what happened to these two machines after he passed away.
That was quite a shock, really. It happened very abruptly.
What year
Would have
was
been
that?
94, I think. I saw Ted in 93 at Bathurst. That, incidentally, referring to your previous question, that was when the two bikes were raced together. And two Bathurst, 93 and 94, they were both there. They did okay. They did okay in the Bears race. But again, Bathurst is one of those circuits for superbikes.
And I guess by then they were well past their heyday.
There was a lot of 916s around by that stage, and the Ducatis were flying again. And of course, we had Britton there as well, John Britton there with his bikes. So really, it was John Britton first every time he came out. But yes, so late '94, I think it was November '94, Ted died, and a couple of weeks later, Mr. Stolarski Dulcie rang me and said, look, Ted wanted you to have something for all your effort racing bikes on the East Coast for so many years. For those who don't know, from the early 80s or mid-80s, we raced in the post-classic class, period 4 up to 1972. And we had a very fast post-classic racer. Bruce Hawksworth was the rider, and he'd been riding Gootsies forever. And he rode it very well. We won quite a few titles with it and acquitted ourselves very well. Got great publicity, great promotion for Gootsie. And basically, Ted saw what we were doing, and he really appreciated it. So when Ted died, Mrs. S rang me and said, look, Ted wanted you to have something for all your efforts racing for so long. So he said, look, we want you to have the bike. We can't give it to you, but we'll give it to you at a price you can't refuse. So basically that was it. And I was in a low ebb at the time, but she gave me time to pay it off, and I bought the bike off them, and I've had taken charge of it ever since.
Were you racing it after you became the owner of it, or did you just use it really for effectively club days?
So we raced it for quite a few years. We won various club titles. We ran well in Victorian titles in the Bears class. I think it was third or fourth we got in the World Superbike support race, Bears support race, behind the Britton and the factory Ducati. That was with Martin Hone riding it. Lovely rider, Martin. And we just kept that going all the way through from once I had control of the bike, it was my bike, and okay, no worries, I can do what I like to it. Okay, here we go, let's start modifying it now. Let's bring it up to some more technology. And that's when as I was saying before, we put bigger valves in it, better cams, tuned the inner track length, tuned the exhaust, and that's when we got it up to decent horsepower. And that's when it acquitted itself fairly well, in the Bears class at least. Open class racing against the factory Yamahas, Suzukis, Hondas, no, it was never going to get near them. But as far as Bears racing go, it was quite good.
And at what point did you decide to retire the bike and restore it back to close to its original trim?
Well, basically from '98 onwards, I started, I'm trying to think of any reasonable reason for it. Things were quietening down in the racing scene at the time. I was moving into teaching at the time, from moving out of the business into TAFE teaching, and I was quite enjoying that, and I looked at that as a career path rather than a extension of the business.
And I guess that gave you less time to look after the bike on a
lot less
full-time basis.
And I started teaching qualifications as well, so that took up a lot more time. But we raced it through till about 2005. We did club meetings and a lot of local meetings. We didn't take it interstate after that, I don't think. No, that'd be right. And up until about 2005, we still did open meetings. In 2005, basically, we took it to Broadford each year. For those who don't know, there's a Easter weekend at Broadford, 4 days of riding on the track. It's not racing, but it's show and tell. Bring your toys out, ride them around the circuit. You've got 15-minute sessions. You get 3 or 4 a day for 2 days, 2.5 days, and it's a fabulous event. Camp on site, evening entertainment. It's just a great, could end up being an international event if it kept going the way it was. COVID, unfortunately, put paid a bit to that. And the bikes always come out to show on that. And we put them out, demonstrate them. A few years ago, 2016, the feature of that year was the Motor Gootsies. And each year there's a theme. So one year it'll be Honda, the next it'll be Ducati, or then Gootsie, and then Pommy bikes or whatever. So the year of the Gootsie was fabulous. Michael brought his MGS-01 down from Sydney, and Tio Lamus had friends of his from Europe, amongst them young Tadero, bring the V8 out, and it was a brilliant event. All these
Apart from the starting problems with the V8, I was there.
Yes.
But
I felt so embarrassed for them.
We won't dwell on that though.
No, it took them a couple of days to get it running. I did put it away wet at the previous event, so that didn't help to Kettering ignition systems. Anyway, they got it going eventually and it sounded fabulous. So that was a great, it's time to showcase the bikes, and I had a guest rider on the bike and I'm not sure what happened, but it had a catastrophic failure at that event. Engine had a catastrophic failure and parked for a couple of years while we chased parts. Just camp followers for these are one-offs, they're not production units. So it took us a while to source those, source other pieces. John White at Competition Valves made new valves for me, beautiful valves. And then it was a matter, I just lightly sandblasted the engine to get the engine back to looking quite clean and tidy again, just to match the gearbox. Basically, it's just wear and tear. The bikes really haven't been changed from new.
No, but at this point you also decided to return it to its original colour scheme too, didn't you?
I thought that was important. Years ago, I had the wheels. The wheels were getting really ratty. No, everything was red. It was just red, red, red. And I thought, right, first step, we'll put the wheels back to yellow. That looked okay. And raced it like that. But when I had the bike in the workshop here and I'm doing the engine, and I'm looking at the fiberglass, and I remember the last time I took the belly pan off, the thing nearly fell into three pieces. Thought, well, it's a bit beyond it now. Either I fix it now or it's never going to run again. It'll fall apart on the track. So, bit of fiberglass work. I've had practice with fiberglass in the past. So I re-fiberglassed all the fairings, reinforced them all, rebuilt them, got the shape back. And then one of the chaps at work where I'm working at Chisholm Institute, Burnt Roland, he was good enough to paint it for us, for money of course, and or equivalent. It cost me a gigolo actually, which was rather
I won't
sad.
ask what that is.
Starts with Z, not a G. 98cc. So he did this beautiful paint job on it, and it's fabulous. A local bloke cut the stickers for us, and Paul, I can't think of his surname off the top of my head, and yeah, just got it back to its original livery, and that's what I wanted. I just wanted the bike back as it was, refitted the parallelogram to it, so it's perfectly the original example. I should mention too, along the way, I was lucky enough to know people in low places, and I happen to know Gary Flood through a few friends, and Gary was good enough to do the front suspension on it. And since that work he did on the suspension, the handling was changed irrecoverably. It was just fabulous. But Gary learnt his trade in MotoGP, or as it was, 500 GP at the time, and he did a beautiful job with the suspension.
And
Anyway,
I believe you're also responsible for a bit of restoration work on the prototype number 2.
Yes, 1980, God, that's getting it wrong. 2020, just 40 years out. 2020, Matt Compton, the owner of this, owner of P2, lives in Western Australia. Matt sent it over here, and the idea was we'd get it ready for Broadford. He sent it over in January, end of January. We had February, half of March to get it going, get it all running. So quickly pulled things apart, had a look at it. My mate Vaughan lives around the corner here, fitter and turner. He came around, he gave us a hand with a few bits and pieces. And yeah, recovered a lot of stuff. There's a few issues with it we didn't pull apart, but we put new belts in it and we checked a few things out, and oil filter. And basically that's pretty much it. Got it up to running, and yeah, basically took it to Broadford as is. Ran it around, ran the two bikes around. Tried getting some video of it, but that wasn't too successful. My video work isn't like yours, Michael.
I don't know, you haven't seen the result of this yet.
No, I think yours would be better. If I can talk you into Broadford this year, that would be fabulous. Coming along and get some video of the two. But they're, they're both very different bikes to ride. But yeah, this one is still, it's been chopped around a lot. I'd like to say, yeah, it's still original, but the bodywork's been changed. I believe it's some Honda bodywork, NS250 or something bodywork that's been modified.
Was that in an attempt to sort of bring the styling up to what was of the era?
I think you're probably right there.
Was that when the exhaust system was moved to the upper behind the seat?
There is. There's a couple of design features I wouldn't actually call features, but yeah, through the early 90s, that was the fashion. Ducati 916s, of course, changed the paradigm. The look of motorcycles changed.
Everything had a under-seat exhaust in the early 2000s, didn't it?
It did, yes. Oh, that's right. Disadvantages, of course, is after 4 or 5 laps of Broadford, your bum's so hot it's very hard to stay on it any
Well, it
longer.
makes you go fast.
It does, and it boils the carburetors too, which is a bit unfortunate. So I put guards and shields in there where we can.
So
down
to
to
finish
that
up, I suppose we should discuss what's the future of these two bikes is going to be.
Well, Matt's unsure at this time. I know he will want to sell it at some stage. He does want to move it on. At the moment, it looks like going up to T.O. Lamos's museum up near Yea in Victoria. And I was supposed to do that earlier this year, but I think now we'll wait until after Broadford, see if we can get some good video of the two bikes together again. And then that can go up to there. Mine, well, I've had my time with that. I've had many great years. I've been the caretaker. I wouldn't say I've been the owner. I've been the caretaker. And at this stage now, I'm happy to pass it on. My son's a fabulous rider. He rides it well. But Benny's
Not a mechanic?
he's
Not interested?
he's a great physiotherapist.
So if you've got a back problem,
Yes,
Great.
exactly. Yes, if you've been riding these for too long, he'll fix you up. No, he's not bad on the tools, but he's got a couple of bikes. He's got his Le Mans 3 and he's got his Monster, Ducati Monster and dirt bikes and such. But no, as far as racing classics and restoring and maintaining classics, it's not his bag. So
it's going to be
Makes-
rather hard to find out what the value is of something that's so, not so much rare, but unique.
yes, exactly. Yeah, that's who knows. I'm not having any guesses. I don't have any pretenses about what it's worth. It's a brilliant original example of the end of a series of motorcycles from 1966, I think 67. The first Goodsey engine of this format, the transverse V-twin, was produced. That's gone through the V7 Sport, through the Le Mans series, through the V11 Sport series, through the Daytona series, and this is the first of the last series. The Daytona effectively was the last of this
I
series
guess
of
we can't
V-twins.
quite count the MGS01 because that's sort of right out there with,
If
it
good-
wasn't a street bike,
exactly.
number one.
Well, the Daytona came out, in 91, 92. If in 95 the MGS01 had come out, Goodsey would have made a lot of inroads into the Ducati market, just purely through their reliability. And the MGS01's just a stunning bike. It really is.
But many years too late.
Yes, and
And
sadly it was.
Thought the Daytona was too late too by 5 years when it came out.
It was too. So it's the last prototype of that series of engines. So what that's worth, I don't know. It's in lovely nick. It runs beautifully still.
Well, I
needs
guess,
a home.
yes, and I guess time will tell what they truly are worth. Well, I
right.
think that about covers everything, Barry. So thanks. I'd like to thank you for your time and certainly some interesting information that I didn't know. There's also a website devoted to these two bikes. I'll put that across the bottom of the frame at this point and also in the comments below for those who are interested in a bit more in-depth history, including interviews with various people involved with these bikes, including riders. Certainly well worth a read. So I think that's about it, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Michael.